Very nice to have you all here on this occasion. Welcome to the Center for the Study of World Religions in Harvard Divinity School.
For the last 3 days, there's been a special academic conference held at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard University, where approximately 35 scholars have come together to look at the theology of the Krishna movement, to look at sociology, history, etc. And it is a very significant event because it's at the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the Krishna movement being brought from India to the West by Swami Bhaktivedanta Prabhupada. And I think it's really denoting the importance that our community has had over the last 50 years. What are the challenges that it's faced and it's facing in the future? A lot of questions are coming up in terms of the balance of tradition and modernity, sociological questions about how do you take an ancient Indian cultural religious movement, bring it into the West, and then from there all around the world, and how does it adjust and balance the different kind of modern impulses with tradition. And some very deep and important questions have been looked at.
The importance of this conference is, I think, really deep. It's deep because it brings scholars on the Bhakti traditions and scholars from the Bhakti traditions together.
When the organizers of the conference came to consult me about the possibility of the Center for the Study of World Religions hosting a 50th anniversary academic event for ISKCON, it seemed to me that it was a very appropriate way to go for us to provide hospitality for the event. So I think if Prabhupada himself came to Harvard Divinity School, it's very appropriate that 50 years later we welcome his children and grandchildren back for an event on our campus.
In May 1968, Srila Prabhupada gave a lecture here at the Divinity School in this very room. I was here. As I rushed to the library through these corridors, when I passed by this very room, the sight was startling. On the table in front of the room, and in saffron robes, there sat a man in a modified Padmasana yoga pose. It stopped me in my tracks. At the door, I stood. I'd never seen anything like this before. Not at Harvard. It doesn't happen here. He was talking about Lord Krishna, the Bhagavad Gita. He talked about peace, all serious subjects for me. Curiously though, alongside these serious subjects, he was also talking about delight and happiness.
Most of the members of ISKCON in 1966 knew almost nothing about the early Chaitanya devotional movement and its participants, or about the later figures who shaped the Vaishnava tradition of Bengal that in September of 1966 laid the foundations for ISKCON. That is to say, they knew almost nothing about Bhaktivedanta's background or where he got his teachings and practices. As a historian, we have to look at the historical situation. And the fact is that there has been no clear parallel to Prabhupada's achievement. The most obvious parallels would be Jesus' founding of Christianity and Muhammad's founding of Islam. Jesus' ministry, however, was among his own people and his own culture, and he had the help of adults, his own age, his disciples, to carry his movement forward. The same thing can be said of Muhammad, who had from the beginning followers from his own culture and his own family to help him establish his movement. Prabhupada, by contrast, was one elderly man in a totally unfamiliar culture with no one else from that culture to support him, and a group of followers initially at benchmark 0. Moreover, unlike many earlier missionaries from Hindu India, he was determined to establish not just an outpost of Hindu devotion to Krishna, but an outpost of Indian Bengali culture as well. He wanted to carry a whole cultural tradition across a huge cultural separation, and he set out to do it himself. He thus not only taught his followers how to practice devotion to Krishna, the Gaudiya Vaishnava way, he also taught them how to cook, how to dress, how to conduct themselves by doing these things. And of course, he taught them Sanskrit, he taught them texts, and he taught them how to teach all of these things to others. He was, in short, a one-man channel for an entire cultural religious tradition, starting when he himself was already 70 years old. How did this work out? Time will, of course, tell, but here we are, 50 years down the road, and looking ahead as well as back. And I might add in closing, ISKCON has on the record done at least as well as Christianity and Islam did in their first 50 years, because both at that point were having serious problems. So may the discussion begin. Harry Bowl.
Interfacing with academics who study religious organizations and know Gaudiya Vaishnavism and know Hinduism and know about world religions, their perspectives enable us to look at ourselves with a critical eye. How can we look with objectivity to how we're doing as a community? And in many ways, compared to other religious organizations, we've done some very wonderful things, but in many ways we've fallen short. And certainly in the first 3 years of our society, and these are things that are being discussed in some of the papers, our focus on transcendence, our focus on going deep in our spiritual, personal, and community led us to minimize developing healthy families and minimize the need for developing healthy communities. And especially at the 50th anniversary, it's a time for us to stop and to take a deep breath and to look back and assess ourselves.
You might say there are two kinds of challenges facing the community now. One is inside ISKCON itself. How is it possible as younger people who not only never met Prabhupada, but were introduced to the faith by people who had never met Prabhupada, when young people bring their own talents and their own questions in the 21st century to ISKCON and to the Bhakti movement of Vaishnavism, how do those new questions, new sensitivities, new attitudes toward culture, toward gender, toward personal authenticity, how do those get factored in?
For me, this conference has been really integrating in a very significant way. On the one hand, I'm here with people who I read about growing up as a child of Krishna devotees. People like Tom Hopkins and Ravindra Swarup Prabhu and Urmila Devi and others, Anuttama, read about them in Prabhupada's biography and in his conversations and so on. And then a whole number of people whose writing formed the main diet as I grew as a scholar. And people like Barbara Holdridge and David Haberman and Frank Clooney and
me.
The external challenges, I think, would be the same faced by people of Jewish or Christian or Muslim tradition. How to keep a credibility, authenticity in relationship to one's own faith tradition, while also showing a true openness to the other. And that in a century in which we're seeing there's so much religious conflict, suspicion, hesitation, how to cultivate a true Vaishnava ISKCON identity that is genuinely open and willing to learn from the other traditions. In all our traditions, we face this problem. What does it mean for a Christian to learn from a Hindu, or a Hindu to learn from a Buddhist, or a Muslim to learn from a Jew? There has to be more than lip service, but it's actually some transformation of consciousness, not simply from within the tradition, but across the religious boundaries as well.
I got off to him and I said, Reverend Cracknell, and he said, Cracknell. No, I didn't even know his name, I couldn't even pronounce his name. So immediately we were into a dialogue.
I see the Hare Krishna movement as a great catalyst for moving people out of their little theological boxes that they inherited as children, Reformed, Catholic, Methodist, Baptist, whatever, into a new time where we follow truth as each of us sees it, and we discuss these things without walls.
And he comes to Ireland and lives on an island in the middle of the lake for a week with Hare Krishnas. He couldn't even get off, you know.
Dialogue is about removing misconceptions. And then, when you've removed ignorance, there's trust. And suddenly you can do things together.
I can't underestimate the service that Kenneth did by lecturing to various groups of devotees. Like Nitma said, we very consciously started to think, how do we become self-critical? And the best way, get people who are friendly, but, honest. And he came in and he helped us reflect us back to ourselves and how to engage with others.
For me, it's been a very illuminating conference. I mean, I'm a scholar of 16th century Gaudiya traditions within my relationship to Krishna Bhakti traditions. I've encountered and known people from ISKCON from many different contexts through the years, but for me, it's just wonderful to sort of get the scope.
I see ISKCON as having matured. It's gone through painful moments, which all of us growing up have to do. But its maturation is in its capacity as an institution to really engage with other faiths, but also to engage with its own householders in ways that it couldn't have 20 years ago. It has leadership who, in fact, can converse with the very best of leadership in the world and other religious traditions. So it has that capacity today it wouldn't have had when the devotees were young and had trouble even pronouncing the Sanskrit words.
I've been telling people in ISKCON ever since I first got my chance to say anything, do your history, do your theology, work out your system. Don't let it just go by. Do it now so that you don't run into trouble in the future. And Shaunako, first thing I ever wrote for Shaunako was saying exactly the same thing.
Tom was one of my gurus. He was one of the first academic directors of the centre in Oxford. He came up to me one time and came into my office and he said, Shaunaka, I heard Prabhupada say that cleanliness is the mark of a Vaishnav, the mark of a gentleman. And I was just looking at him kind of, he's sharing a moment of remembrance of Prabhupada, and then he said, have you seen your kitchen?
I do wonder whether somebody like me can really understand completely the ecstasy of identification with devotion, and I really want to. And so, for me to hear the devotees talking as well as scholars is very important. I'd like to position myself sort of inside the movement and with a loving relationship rather than outside trying to pick holes.
The Rasa Leela, the dance of the essence, the dance of life, in which Krishna is superimposed between each of the gopi girls. So he has multiplied himself, so he's present to every one of them. It can be understood on several levels. One is the spiritual level, and that's the level of where the pure devotee seeks to have that dance, that union, that hopes to have that union with Krishna. I think it also could be symbolic of the way in which ISKCON as a movement is understood and what its role can be. If devotees understand themselves, not just standing in a circle with them alone, but with people from other parts of the world and people who aren't religious at all, but people who can find joy in being together and celebrating together, the Rasa Leela could be a wonderful message for peacemaking in this world in which we find conflict with people with whom we disagree. ISKCON can play a very valuable role and has wonderful leaders now who are trying to promote that kind of conversation where we have a Rasa Leela and it's a dance and it's a joyful dance in which we, out of all of our faiths, are appreciating God together by the way we live our lives.
I want to encourage ISKCON to write its history. I want to encourage ISKCON to do its theology. But I mostly want ISKCON just to stay with this bhakti thing. It's really good stuff. And it will get you there. That's all I have.